When I was little, two of my favorite Disney products of all time were The Lion King and Finding Nemo. I thought they were fun, colorful, had great songs, and I had a great time with the characters. As I grew older though, there were films that I ended up liking more than those movies, but the time spent with The Lion King and Finding Nemo are memories that I'll always cherish in my heart. So imagine real quick if both The Lion King and Finding Nemo were mixed into one movie. That is an idea that does sound like a match made in heaven, but unfortunately, that combination was a recipe for disaster that resulted in today's subject, the wild. But before getting into this one, allow me to get a bit of context first. Back in the 2000s, DreamWorks was one of Disney's biggest competitors, starting in the late 90s with the rivalry between Ants and A Bug's Life after Jeffrey Katzenberg stepped down from Disney after the incident with The Lion King and the Toy Story Black Friday reel, resulting in both companies releasing very similar animated movies afterwards with similar concepts, one of which being Shark Tale, which released a year after Finding Nemo, even though that movie is completely different from Finding Nemo, and more important to the context for today's subject, Madagascar. Although, a funny thing to mention about both films is that in spite of the fact that both movies were in production for a similar amount of time, The Wild began production first. It's just that Madagascar beat this movie to the punch by almost a year, so when this movie ended up being released less than a year after Madagascar, it inevitably had to face comparisons between each other. And the similarities between both movies are pretty apparent, as both movies revolve around zoo animals going into the wild and coming across a bunch of new characters, not helped by the fact that the wild is also stealing from two other movies. But all of these comparisons between Madagascar and the wild chalk up to coincidences, where with Madagascar, the zoo animals were forced into the wild because Marty went to Central Station and they got caught and were sent to the wild. This movie has the lion cub get sent out to the wild immediately, and the other zoo animals had to go out and save them. More on that in a little bit. It reminds me of the common criticisms that a show like Bonkers received, where it was accused of being a Roger Rabbit ripoff, but behind the scenes, they wanted to make a Roger Rabbit show, but couldn't make a Roger Rabbit show, but decided to use a character from Raw Tunage instead, which is why his segments from that show were far different than what ended up being in the actual show. Though, that's the least of that show's problems, and I might end up reviewing that show in the future when I get back to binge-watching shows for Sean's network reviews. But there are other parts of this film where it gets way too close for comfort in regards to the similarities. Basically, the chameleons that the zoo animals come across in the wild are very similar to the penguins from Madagascar. And no, I'm not referencing the show. The one difference is that these are last-minute characters, while the penguins from Madagascar were fully involved in the plot. The rest of the movie is completely different, and that it takes from other films. Again, I'll get to that later. So, to get the common backlash that this movie received out of the way, no, it's not a ripoff of Madagascar, but I don't blame people for thinking that it is. It's kind of like what happened with Bubsy 3D, where it was wanting to do something that wasn't commonly done in video games before, but then comes Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot, to ruin all chances for it to reach the same levels of success. Only difference is that even if The Wild was released before Madagascar, and that film had to be the one to face comparisons, this movie would still be bad no matter what, because this movie is not funny, like in any way whatsoever. Where Madagascar had plenty of jokes and laughs to be found, The Wild has very few to be found. Literally every single joke in this movie either involves something related to poop, farts, or gross out. Such as that one sequence where Samson basically smells Ryan's scent, only for the hilarious punchline to be that he was smelling a Hyrax taking a dump in a tree. I really hate this movie for making me utter that sentence. And of course, the sequence with the dung beetles. But another thing that this movie likes to do is that it really likes to hammer its jokes into the audience, as if the film has no confidence in its own humor because of how unfunny it is. So they decide to repeat their own jokes ad nauseum throughout the entirety of the film. The first joke that they decided to repeat is having Ryan try to roar, but his roar is so pathetic that he ends up making others laugh as a result. It's like they decided to take that one sequence from The Lion King where Simba tries to roar, but it comes out weak, and repeated it throughout the entire movie. And it does this way more than just 3 times. Except, it's not even funny. It just comes off as ageist, because young lions don't have the ability to roar yet like adult lions do. So this comes off as intentionally mean, and it's not even just the villains that do this. But even worse than that, the movie constantly shoves down your throat the funny joke where everyone laughs at Nigel because a stuffed koala that looks exactly like him says, "I'm so cuddly, I like you." And they run this joke so far into the ground that I just want to do what Plankton did in that one SpongeBob episode and scream, I get it! And I'd even argue that this joke was not even funny to begin with, because not only does it not build off of anything to make the joke land, but there's absolutely nothing funny about watching the other characters blatantly harassing Nigel over something that he has no control over, because Nigel did not make this toy at all. Maybe this is where Ed, Edd and Eddy got its idea from with that awful episode where the other characters harass Eddie because of a bad school picture he took, but give that episode this, that was only 11 minutes. This, however, is over an hour long. I may not like Nigel all that much in this movie, because he's essentially just King Julian without any of the charm or likability, especially since when the wildebeests were about to eat the main characters, he was debating on whether he should be ruler or let his friends die, but he certainly didn't deserve to be harassed for something that he had no control over. And I'm not even looking too deep within it either. All throughout the film, the characters repeatedly mock and make fun of Nigel for the plushie that was based on him, and the other characters even start getting physical at one point with him. And we also certainly didn't need an entire song related to this repetitive joke. Yeah, the song titled Very Nice Day is based off of this stuffed koala. And while we're on the subject of the humor coming off as intentionally mean-spirited and offensive, some other content could also come across as racist. The movie decided to throw in a Canadian stereotype joke by not only having Nigel ask the Canadian geese about something related to their home country, which is something they might not know about at the moment, but also have them act stereotypical by saying "Eee" after every sentence. Because it already wasn't enough that the Angry Beavers, King of the Hill, the Loud House, and Power Players had episodes where Canadian stereotype characters say "Eee" after every sentence. And not just that, the crocodiles that the main characters meet in the sewer literally act like black stereotypes. Movie, I'm pretty sure that you didn't mean any harm with this joke. However, think through your implications, movie! And even without the comparisons to Madagascar that this movie has to worry about, the other films that this movie copies off of are way less excusable. This movie is basically a combination ripoff of other films, my absolute favorite kind of movie.
Oh, by the way, I was being sarcastic.
The movies that this film blatantly copies off of are The Lion King and Finding Nemo. The Lion King with the father and son dynamic, more or less, and the part where the father has to find his son. Although the issue is that just like Brave, this movie completely misses the point of the movies that it's blatantly copying off of, which by extension extends to this movie's god-awful writing, which is so bad to the point where this feels like a parody of The Lion King and Finding Nemo, which was made incredibly stupid on purpose to get a laugh. But no, this was actually real, and was able to be released to the public without anyone on the team asking, why? Why are we releasing this movie like this, and why can't we give it another rewrite? In The Lion King, the reason why Mufasa scolded his son was because he disobeyed his orders not to go to the elephant graveyard. And in Finding Nemo, the reason why Nemo ended up getting captured in that film was out of his control. Well, this movie decided to throw all of that right out the window, as the reason why Samson scolds his son is because he accidentally, not on purpose, causes Samson's team to lose the ice hockey game. Congrats, movie. Just like that one terrible episode of Drake and Josh, you showed me one of the main reasons as to why I don't care all that much about sports. And Ryan literally walked himself into the situation where he gets captured by directly walking into a green box. Only difference is that this movie has very little content to justify its length, which is another major problem with this movie. Fun fact, when I was younger, I don't even remember being able to finish this movie, and I honestly have no clue what it was. I always remember dozing out around the time when Samson decides to tell his tragic backstory, and that was when I remembered either zoning out or something. And rewatching it for this review, I now completely understand why. This movie is boring! Like, legit, this film has very little of what you can consider as a plot or narrative. The only thing of actual value that this movie has is the whole thing with saving Ryan, but the film completely drops that since as soon as we find Ryan, the goal of the film is complete, and all we have to worry about for the rest of the film is the villain. But the film overcompensates with how little story it has, that it decides to cram in as much noise so that the children won't get bored. Well, that didn't work out well, because I remembered being bored with this movie even as a child. This would be like if in Finding Nemo, instead of seeing the actual journey of Marlin and Dory traveling across the ocean, they decide to put the journey in a montage and have a majority of the film be in Sydney, which is not a good idea, because that would have added needless fluff to the film. And that's basically what this movie does. Most of the movie is set in this jungle, with the only thing of significance happening is the wildebeest capturing the characters one by one. Essentially, in regards to this movie's lack of story, it also reminds me of Rock Dog, which, if you watched my review on that, it was also a film that had very little of what you could consider a plot. So the middle of that film also dragged out with useless filler and funny shenanigans with Bodhi trying to get into Angus Scattergood's house. But this movie is worse with this problem than Rock Dog, because at least Rock Dog wasn't obnoxious, while this movie is. It's like this movie knows that it doesn't have much of a story to begin with, so instead of giving the film a rewrite to make sure that the film has a more coherent narrative to it, they decided to do the equivalent of jingling keys in front of people's faces. Meaning that this movie never shuts up. It's basically kind of like a Thundercats Roar situation, where the film is so afraid of losing the kid's attention that it constantly bops you over the head with wacky sound effects, talking, and most of all, the characters screaming most of their lines! Too bad the movie on paper doesn't seem like it was going to do this at first. Which is the other problem with this movie, and by extension, my biggest problem with the film. Just like Ollie's Pack, this film seems to have an identity problem with itself, as the film has no clue of what it wants to do with itself. When you look at the film's poster, you'd expect that this movie is supposed to be some sort of overglorified tech demo, meant to show off the technology like Dinosaur or The Lion King 2019, but when digging deeper into it, it doesn't want to do that at all. The film wants to be a comedy like Madagascar, or even like other Disney movies like Hercules or The Emperor's New Groove. But, as established, this movie is not funny in the slightest. As people stated with The Lion King 2019, when you make the film more realistic, it takes away the exaggeration, which makes visual jokes land awkwardly, and makes them fall flat. Even if the movie does not do slapstick properly, you can't just inherently have characters being hit against something to make them land. This isn't something like Rocky and Bullwinkle, where it relies more on its dialogue humor, so the animation being extremely low budget helped it out in the end. A lot of this movie's humor relies solely on its visuals, but it does not take that opportunity as the animation is not energetic enough to make the jokes land. By making its characters more realistic, they ironically make them unappealing as a result. The animals in this movie look very ugly, if I'm being honest with you guys. Not even in a way where it's charming or unique like Ed and Nettie, but in an unappealing way. What makes this movie's peers like Madagascar work is that the animation is expressive enough to make it work. Not to mention, it uses its medium to make the animals more exaggerated and appealing. That film may be dated in a lot of aspects, especially since cartoony CGI has come a long way, but it uses its medium to its advantage. The Wild tries to be realistic, however, at the exact same time, it also feels like they gave up halfway through because they ran out of budget, leaving the animals to not look appealing nor realistic. As there are a lot of sequences where characters look plasticky, and there are other style choices that clashes with it. Not to mention, their expressions are as stiff as a doorknob. Not as bad as The Lion King 2019, 2019, but it shares one of its problems. Seriously, movie, if you want to be realistic, why are you also throwing in other designs that look more cartoony in comparison to the other animals? As if this movie's identity issue wasn't enough. And this movie's choice of throwing in cartoony sound effects is such a baffling decision. If there's something that you could at least give the Hotel Transylvania movies some credit for, those films at least meshes well with those sound effects, because it matches the visuals that happen on screen. This movie, on the other hand, doesn't. It also gives me vibes of that Inspector Gadget movie from 1999, which threw in cartoony sound effects just because it wanted to, whereas with The Mask from 1994, at least fits with this. But at least that film could be classified as being so bad it's good because of Matthew Broderick's awkward performance.
No! I gotta get out of here.
This movie, on the other hand, is just jingling keys in kids' faces. And when I can confidently say that both Home on the Range and Chicken Little, while both of them had their own problems, were able to pull this off better than The Wild, you have a major problem. And with how awful the writing is in this movie, this also heavily affects the characters. Almost all of them either fall into the category of being annoying, bland, or the thing that this film uses for half of its main characters, a narcissist. Remember in The Lion King how touching the bond between Mufasa and Simba were in that film? Yeah, throw all of that out the window entirely, because I don't like Samson or Ryan in this movie. If I could do a Chad and Virgin picture, using characters from this movie and The Lion King, Mufasa would basically be the Chad, while Samson would basically be the Virgin. Samson is very, very boring. Not to mention, he gets upset over the tiniest and most insignificant things. Like, chill out, dude, it's just a game. Again, the reason why Mufasa got upset with Simba and The Lion King was for something that was more major. Not to mention, this movie's extremely poor writing does a terrible job at conveying things. This movie is basically another liar reveal story, where a character is basically hiding something, only for it to be revealed later in the movie. As if Disney didn't already give us enough of those in the 90s and 2000s. But with how Samson is like in this movie, I gotta ask, why lie exactly? I can understand him feeling on edge a lot of the time, because he himself went through his own situation of having an emotionally abusive father, but that's not enough to justify lying to everyone, including his own son. Going back to Finding Nemo real quick, the reason why Marlin was so scared to go out of his own home was because he was scarred by the death of his wife and unborn children, which made him paranoid for Nemo's own safety, because he was still grieving over the loss of his wife. And the entire movie was basically doing this to teach Marlin a lesson to not let fear cloud up your judgments. And it was understandable there because you'd feel this emotionally distraught if this happened to you in real life. The only reason I presume that Samson is doing this is so that he could boost up his own ego. Given that he constantly told stories about how he was this noble warrior of the wild, when he never accomplished anything in his life. While he isn't as bad as Ping from Duck Duck Goose because he doesn't do anything that heinous in the film, what he did was still very negligent, because through his lies, he got Ryan eager enough to go into the wild that he decided to get into the green box. And also gets his friends put in danger by not revealing that he was not from the wild until it's too late. And the movie does not give us an explanation for this. Also, all Samson could have done was say that he wasn't from the wild, and that he had a horrible father that disapproved of his son's inability to roar very well. And they'd probably be more understanding towards that fact, because he was a child, and young lions don't roar as well as adult lions do. And on the off chance that they'd laugh at him if they found out, that would definitely emphasize the fact that this movie is incredibly ageist. And Ryan is not much better. All he does throughout the first portion of the movie is sulk about how he wants to be a real lion with a good roar, basically this movie's equivalent of Taran from the Black Cauldron, and to go out to the wild, but then when he gets that, He basically becomes a damsel in distress for the others to go and save. Also, Hi Beast Boy from Teen Titans, yes, that's the same voice actor, Greg Sipes.
The saddest part of it all is that this movie came out almost 3 months after the original Teen Titans ended on a huge cliffhanger. 2006 was a pretty depressing year for TV shows and movies the more I think about it.
Benny's crush that he has on Bridget is a whole other level of disgusting, not only because of the fact that making things work between a giraffe and a squirrel is completely impossible, but also, it's like this movie wants to make a Johnny Bravo type of character, but they never actually realized what made that show work and the self-awareness it had. This movie has no self-awareness on the fact that Benny proclaiming that he and Bridget are dating and the way he's flirting is not how you should act towards a woman. Sure, in the later Madagascar movies, Melman and Gloria were also different species and were also romantically interested in each other, but the difference is that at least Melman and Gloria were around the same height, given that giraffes are known to have long necks, and it was more subtle about the fact that Melman likes her, and it's honestly more sweet for that. This movie's implications just come across as disturbing, given that it's a squirrel falling in love with a giraffe. Benny is way too small for her, and Benny just comes across as very creepy, and is also a narcissist as well. Larry is useless and annoying. Definitely Richard Kind's worst performance by far. Nigel, as I said, is basically King Julian without the charm, even though I do feel sorry for him that he has to be bullied throughout the film. Bridget is just bland, and does even less for the plot than Larry does. The main villain, Kazar, is absolutely stupid, which segues into another issue that I have with this movie. The film gets some of its animal facts embarrassingly wrong, to the point where it ends up hurting the film as a result. I'm not usually the type of person that really gets onto any piece of media for getting real-world animal facts wrong. I know that people have gotten onto shows like Back at the Barnyard and Breadwinners for doing this, but if we were to condemn every single piece of media for not being 100% accurate to real-world animals, then we'd probably condemn Tom and Jerry for having Tom drink milk, despite the fact that cats in real life are lactose intolerant, and Jerry eating cheese, even though mice love peanut butter more, as well as Looney Tunes for having Bugs Bunny eating carrots when they care more about leafy greens. But at the end of the day, those are common things that you'd associate with those animals. The wild, however, is incredibly distracting with this. If you know how wildebeests are like in real life, Kazar's villain plan is one of the worst villain plans that I've ever seen in an animated movie. And I've watched Norm of the North, which had the main villain wanting to sell condos in the Arctic. Never have I seen an animated movie where even if the main villains were to win, they technically also lose at the end of the day. Because if you know anything about how wildebeests are like in real life, you would realize that the villain's plan would definitely backfire on them. Because wildebeests cannot eat meat. Their stomachs are not designed to be able to eat meat. They can only eat grass. So, if the main heroes were to lose, then the villains would also lose, because they wouldn't be able to handle it, leading the movie to have zero tension. Oh, and speaking of voices, Patrick Warburton plays one of Kazar's henchmen, and guess who he's playing in this movie? He's playing Kronk! Another version of Kronk, which this movie stole. So overall, this movie is awful. Not the absolute worst animated movie that I've ever seen. This movie is still better than Brave because that movie is draining on top of being obnoxious, and that film's intention to copy off of other films are more obvious, while The Wild is just annoying. And you could argue that this movie's similarities to Madagascar are just sheer coincidence, but I'd honestly take something like Walking with Dinosaurs 2013 and Ice Age Collision Course over this, because those two were only made bad because of last-minute decisions, the crew running out of ideas, and corporate demand. The Wild, on the other hand, was always meant to be like this, and it's kind of ironic when you think about it. During the 2000s decade, the movies that Disney or Pixar made often did better than the movies that DreamWorks made, that was basically done to, quote, capitalize off the success of Disney movies, but this is the one case where the DreamWorks movie, Madagascar, was the more remembered of the two, while The Wild, similar to Home on the Range and Mars Needs Moms, basically fell into obscurity. And after rewatching this movie for a review, I can definitely see why. My recommendation for this movie is obvious. Just skip out on this movie entirely and just watch The Lion King, Finding Nemo, and Madagascar instead. They'll give you much more entertainment, joy, and laughs than this movie. Not to mention, those films could be enjoyed by anyone of any age, while The Wild, I doubt could appeal to anyone. Heck, I'm doubtful if even children would be able to get into this one because of how much nothing happens, and adults would find this movie too obnoxious and immature to get into, on top of this movie being boring. And considering the fact that this movie was distributed by Disney of all companies, that just makes this movie even worse, because Disney really should have known better than to put this movie out. But then I remembered that this movie came out in 2006, at a time when Disney was basically at one of its lowest points that they've ever been. And I basically sigh because the mid-2000s was a very dark age for Disney.
Everything